Hey everyone, it's Brandan Robertson here. I am a progressive Christian pastor, author, theologian of sorts, and I want to welcome you to a new project called Reconstruct. And if you've been following me over the past probably year or so, you've noticed that this podcast has gone through so many different iterations. I actually kind of got my start in public life, so to speak, years ago when I was a teenager. And I started an online radio show at the time that was called Prayer Warriors Radio. And then over the years, when I got to college, I launched a radio show and podcast that was called The Bridge. And then that evolved into something called Revangelical, which in the early 2010s was kind of a biggish show in the evangelical, kind of progressive evangelical world. And podcasting really became a passion of mine back then, and really cultivating conversations around Christian spirituality in particular and theology was a passion of mine. Getting to interview theologians and authors and teachers and pastors about what it means to follow Jesus, what different aspects of theology mean and how they can inform our faith, that was something really compelling to me. And so when I jumped back into podcasting about a year ago, I had an idea for a podcast called Patchwork, which was more of a broad concept that was relying on my desire to be a bridge builder. I have a passion for helping people understand those who see things differently. And so Patchwork initially was a podcast where I was going to interview people from differing perspectives on various political and religious issues. And it ended up being kind of a variety show where I got to interview authors and political commentators and public figures from all across the board in every different kind of background and arena. And so, it kind of lost focus. And as it lost focus, I kind of lost interest in the concept. And so I thought I was going to start a podcast about progressive politics. And I quickly kind of gave up on that idea because there are plenty of other people speaking on that topic that can do that very well. And so as I've been thinking and reflecting and talking to people, trying to figure out what kind of conversations could be helpful to not just me, but to a broader audience, it became really clear that there is something happening within the progressive faith world where a lot of people who have gone through this thing called deconstruction, which essentially is a word that means we've taken apart the fundamentals of our conservative faith and we've questioned and scrutinized all of the different aspects of what we once believed and what we were taught to believe. And once we've deconstructed, most of us have been left with this emptiness, this I don't want to say unwillingness, but a lack of understanding of where our next right step would be on this journey of faith. And when you kind of lose your faith foundation, it kind of forces a lot of us into this realm of existential crisis, of not knowing what is real or true, what the purpose of life is, who God is, or what God is, or even if there is a God. And particularly if we can still be a part of this thing called Christianity. And if we stay in that space, for some people, that's a fine space to be in long term. But I think for a vast majority of us, we are looking for something a little more solid. Not certainty that we once had, not a religious system like we once were a part of, but at least some answers that help give us curiosity once again and inspire a sense of wonder rather than this agnostic, existential sense of I don't know. And I've got to be honest, I'm always been pretty compelled by existentialism, and Albert Camus and his writings were some of my favorite writings, if you're familiar. And he's kind of an existentialist writer that basically came to the conclusion that life had no purpose and no meaning, and kind of lived into that existential angst. And there's something compelling about that, and I think for some of us, that is a compelling way to live, kind of a rebellion against the absurdity of existence. But again, I think for a lot of us, we want something a little bit more. And I'm beginning this podcast not with any answers or a desire to teach anybody anything, but rather this is an authentic journey for me. Yes, I'm serving as a progressive pastor. And yes, I write about theology and talk about spirituality and God all day, every day. But the truth is, I don't have very many answers when it comes down to what I actually believe is true. And that's a vulnerable thing to say, because for a lot of people, especially people in my own church, that might sound disconcerting. But the truth is that most of the great theologians and philosophers through the ages have come to this fundamental conclusion. It's St. Augustine who said, "We are talking about God. What wonder is it that you do not understand? For if you understood, you would no longer be talking about God." I believe that's true fundamentally. I believe that the stuff we're trying to get at in our pursuit of religious knowledge and experience are these big questions that are ultimately outside of our grasp. But the truth is, there are also a lot of people who have been coming up with and discovering and rediscovering compelling ideas and understandings of Christian faith, of the way of Jesus, of what it means to be a human, of what God is, of where we're going. And I want to go on this journey to hopefully begin to reconstruct a version of Christian faith that is life-giving, that lives in the tensions that really exist in our world, and that ultimately inspire a little bit of hope and wonder. And that's what this podcast is. It's an experiment. I'm going to talk to my friends who are writers, theologians, teachers of spirituality. Many of them are Christians, some of them will not be. All of this is an attempt to authentically ask the questions that are on my heart and in my mind, and help me begin to understand and hopefully rebuild some version of faith, whatever that looks like. Because the truth is, for me at least, I know I don't have the faith to be an atheist. And for some of you, you just rolled your eyes when you heard me say that. But I've grappled on that edge of like, well, do I believe anything anymore? And I do believe that there's something going on in the universe. I do believe that our lives have some purpose and meaning. And I do find myself deeply compelled with Jesus, as I know so many of us do, even if we don't know exactly why. This podcast is, I hope, a compelling space where we can have real conversations that help us begin to put back together something that looks like faith. And maybe putting back together isn't the right way of saying it. Maybe it's rebuild something for the first time, or build something for the first time, something new. So let's go on this journey together. That's what this whole thing is about. Rebuilding our faith one conversation at a time, reconstructing after deconstruction, and seeing if we can maybe get a little bit of a solid ground to stand on. And maybe that's a vain pursuit. Maybe that's impossible. But I think the journey is worth it. Not to go off on a diatribe, but one of the stories that has compelled me from the Bible for years is the story of Abram in Genesis chapter 12. And the story goes essentially that God shows up out of the blue and speaks to Abram and says, "Leave everything you have, everything your family has inherited, and begin walking to a land that I will show you. And if you go, I'll bless you." And what's really amazing about that story is we know nothing about Abram other than he gets this prompting from something he understands to be God, that tells him to leave behind everything he knew and just start walking with no real direction, no promise or indication of where Abram's going, or even necessarily why Abram's going. But in Genesis chapter 12, verse 4, it says, "Thus Abram departed." Abram goes. He steps outside of the boundaries of everything he knew that was safe and good, everything that gave him security, and he began walking on a path, following the wild winds of the Spirit. That's what I long for in my faith journey. That's what I hope this journey of reconstruction can be for me and for those of you who join me on this journey on this podcast. That we can step beyond all that we've left behind, all the things that have hurt us, the toxic ways of talking about life and humans and God and sin, and we can begin to follow this curiosity that we can call the Spirit into a new terrain, into a new way of seeing and being in the world. Again, I truly have no idea where this is going to go, but I am really excited to dig in, to listen, to learn, to disagree, and to see if we can articulate some version of faith that works for our lives and our world in these most peculiar of times. So if you're up for that journey, I hope you'll subscribe, and I hope you'll follow along as over the next 6 months we dig into these conversations. I'm going to try to publish a podcast twice a month. I'm going to try to keep the podcast to 45 minutes to an hour, and it's going to be conversations about big theological topics with people that have lots of experience and have done a lot of thinking on these topics. So I hope it's helpful. I'm excited to see where it goes, and I'm excited to be walking this journey with you. So thanks for listening in. I hope you'll hit subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks when we officially launch with our first episode, an interview with my friend, Dr. Peter Enns, a professor of Bible and theology at Eastern University in Philadelphia. So until then, I hope you're waiting in anticipation for Reconstruct, where we're rebuilding our faith one conversation at a time.